Welcome to Way Over Our Heads, a podcast on climate and weather. I'm Jim Dubois. Kenny Blumenfeld, who's a climatologist, is here today. Kenny, how you doing?
Oh, made it through another weekend, and I'm very glad to be here. How are you, Jim?
I'm doing well. Well, we need to recap the snowstorm that we talked about the last time we got together.
Wait, what storm? Wait, was there what storm? Wait, there... Oh, yeah, that one.
Right. And it did turn out, at least in the Twin Cities, to be an underachiever.
Do you think I sold it a little short in southern Minnesota?
Maybe just a tad. Because they did get some snow worthy of talking about.
Yeah, I mean, for a minute anyway.
Right.
They got snow worthy of talking about for a minute, but they're going to forget it. Guarantee it. We can check back with them. They'll forget about it. So we ended up with the heaviest snow reaching into the far southern metropolitan area. 5-6 inches there, but as you got farther south in the area, Rochester, Mankato, 6, 8, maybe even 10 inches were a bit more common. Didn't quite make it over into the Eau Claire area. It was a pretty good burst of snow when it first began on Saturday, and that was something we expected, and then it really kind of fizzled a bit after that. So big burst of snow in the Twin Cities with intense snowfall rates for about an hour or so, and then it kind of cut off. I was up on the south shore of Lake Superior, and the waves were absolutely roaring and into that Park Point area in Duluth.
Didn't they have to rescue some folks who got carried away on a piece of ice?
Yeah. So the annual lake ice rescue count is up a little bit this year, but the waves were vicious. I mean, they were the size of garages. I mean, these were big waves coming in. And whenever you get a wind off of that open water, and it's a 30 mile an hour plus wind on Lake Superior, but you do see waves, but those were some of the biggest I'd seen.
Well, we'll go from that and talk about some rather boring weather. There's nothing really all that interesting on the horizon, is there?
As a meteorologist, climatologist, this is a little bit dreadful. I will say I've been speaking with some farmers and people who work in agriculture. They actually need a boring winter, especially in southern Minnesota, where they went into the fall with a lot of moisture in the soil and then froze up. So what they need least would be a big snowpack and then a lot of precipitation in the spring as that snowpack is melting. That would be a disaster for them. So it's a mixed blessing, but for those of us who are enthusiasts, it's dreadful. We were supposed to be sunny this weekend, weren't we?
I thought so too.
Yeah, where'd that go?
Yeah. Now it popped out a little bit today.
Yeah, but that doesn't
sunny.
count.
This is a Sunday.
You heard my brethren talking about it's going to be clear and beautiful. And I have to admit, I kind of thought it was too. It was cold, and with cold weather, you usually have high pressure. High pressure means sinking air. Sinking air clears out the clouds. And so you often have clear skies associated with that high pressure. But I guess the lingering snowpack was just too much, and it released a little bit of moisture into the air and kept those clouds around. But it wasn't exciting. And it looks like the next week, that week beginning December 10th, and that week doesn't have anything of real importance or interest to Minnesota or the nearby surrounding areas. It looks like temperatures near normal during the day, 20s, maybe getting into the 30s, and staying a little bit above normal at night. So it's not going to be cold, but it's also not going to be warm, and it's certainly not going to be hazardous, which, again, a mixed blessing. That's some really bad news for the enthusiasts.
Now, we're still a couple of weeks out, but are you feeling a gray Christmas on the horizon here, or is it too soon to tell?
Well, I'm not feeling a really white one. We're right at the critical point, right around December 10th. If you have a thick snowpack down, and I mean 6 inches or more, you tend to have a colder remainder of December into January than if you don't have that 6-inch snowpack. We could be a little lenient and say, well, maybe 4 inches, but we're not there. It looks like it's probably going to come off the ground in the next week. And unless it gets replenished, there's still plenty of time between here and Christmas.
Right.
It is winter. It is dark. Any snow that falls will probably stick. It's just the prospects don't seem great. I'm not calling for a brown one.
Okay.
Not yet. But I'm also not calling for a, fresh...
sparkling white Christmas?
With a giant 1.5 foot snowpack. No, I don't see that right now.
Well, last time we got together, we promised we'd talk about some top weather events in Minnesota. And you've come up with a top 5 list.
Yeah, and I think we also said to our listener, we said, we might have more than that. But I think we also said, we'll talk a little bit. I know we started it last week. Why, Jim? Why is Minnesota's weather so interesting? What is it about our location? Should we cover that?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
All right. So it really has everything to do with geography. I remember my 6th grade teacher was telling us one of the reasons Minnesota's so extreme is we're at 45 degrees, we're centered on 45 degrees latitude. We're right between the equator and the North Pole. And he got that part right. That is true. And that exposes us to kind of equal parts summer and winter. And so just by virtue of our latitude, we are very seasonal. But you could say the exact same thing about Seattle. And we know, is Seattle's weather as exciting as ours?
No, not at all. Now, is that the ocean effect?
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, why would you say Seattle's weather is nothing like Minnesota's, even though we're at roughly the same latitude?
Right. I would think it would have to have something to do with the ocean.
Yeah, the ocean. Well, let's just keep it going. If you characterize Seattle, and for those of you who don't know where Seattle is, it sits near the west coast of Washington. It's actually in the Puget Sound, but it's close enough to the ocean to count. It's essentially the ocean. It's just not the open ocean yet. And so they get a big fresh blast of ocean air. Now let's think about what this means, Jim. What do you think when you picture Seattle's summer? Is it as hot as ours?
No.
And what about their winter?
Probably a lot milder.
Yeah, even though they're at the same latitude. So my 6th grade teacher got it partially right. Latitude is important, but what really helps us get those temperature extremes is that we're landlocked. We're not near any ocean. And the ocean that we have the most access to is actually the Atlantic through the Gulf of Mexico. But it's not like we're sitting right next to the Gulf of Mexico the way Houston is. So if you went down to Houston, they have brutal summers and they're pretty mild, really warm and sometimes even humid winters. But here, we're really only influenced by the Gulf of Mexico when the wind blows from the south. Well, with just about equal frequency, we get the wind blowing from the north. And when the wind blows from the north, it's blowing out of, central Canada or the Arctic region. And even if the wind blows from the west, sure, the Pacific Ocean is to our west, but the air has to cross over the mountains where it gets modified. First, it's forced to rise, and then as it descends on the other side, it actually dries out. So when the air blows from the west, it's kind of neutral. It's somewhat mild. It doesn't have much of an ocean influence left in it. But when it blows from the south, it tends to be very warm and sometimes humid. When it blows from the north, which is basically what winter is,
right,
tends to be cold. So we are intensely seasonal because we are right between the equator and the North Pole, but we are also in the middle of the continent. We have this continental or seasonal climate. So that, Jim, is why we have such great weather. Now you want to talk about some examples of that amazing weather that situation has provided us?
Absolutely. Well, and these are in no particular order. We're not ranking them in terms of how devastating they were or any of that. But we'll go back, first of all, to October of 1949, an event that I didn't even know about.
Oh, this was amazing. So this is October 9th, 10th of 1949?
Yeah, the Mammoth Non-Convective Windstorm.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so this was a massive event. It actually was a regional windstorm. So usually when we think of winds, we think of the kinds that if they're going to do damage, they come with thunderstorms, right? So thunderstorm winds, for 15 minutes gusting, 60, 70, maybe 80 miles an hour. Well, when you get a really strong low pressure system, and I told listeners, we'll talk about those a lot, but these are the circulating areas of low pressure, and the tighter that gradient, the faster the change in pressure, the stronger the winds are. And a lot of our big weather events from the past are tied to low pressure systems. This one is no exception. This was a beast. It was a rapidly deepening, about the same intensity as a low-end hurricane. And as it moved through the region, it kind of moved south to north across basically the Missouri River Valley. And that trajectory exposed Minnesota to a sweet spot of prolonged, very strong winds. Winds at Rochester gusted to 100 miles an hour.
Wow.
We had official reports of over hurricane force at the Twin Cities at the old, airport station.
Right.
And we had reports of thousands of power poles snapped across Minnesota. There were buildings collapsed. There were boats piled up on some of the inland lakes. Well, obviously all of our lakes are inland, but in some of the lakes, some of the buildings in downtown Minneapolis also gave way. So there were injuries and deaths. And this was multiple hours of strong. Now, it wasn't entirely hurricane force winds, but we're talking about you go outside in the morning, the wind's 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. It hits its peak sometime in the early afternoon, and the winds were 50, 60, 70 miles an hour with gusts up to 80, 90, and 100 miles an hour.
So these are sustained winds of 50, 60, 70 miles
Correct.
per hour.
Yes, these were yes, and this actually produced widespread fatalities across the region outside of Minnesota. I think we were in the teens. It's hard to get a body count back then, but we were in the teens for deaths, had another few dozen injuries, and then because it was basically how many inflation cycles ago, it's always really hard to estimate what the costs of that kind of event would be. But this was a disaster, any way you look at it.
Well, I saw one of the interesting occurrences during this event was the evacuation of the upper floors of the Fauché Tower, which at the time was the tallest building in Minneapolis, and people were being evacuated because the building was swaying and people were getting seasick.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
it
takes not just a fast wind, but it takes a prolonged exposure to that fast wind to do that.
Right.
Rock those skyscrapers, man. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go back to 1867 for our next event, the greatest flash flood in Minnesota history.
Yeah. So in 2007, the town of Hoka in southeastern Minnesota broke the all-time rainfall event record for the state of Minnesota. And this is the largest officially recorded rainfall in 24 hours in Minnesota. It was 15.1 inches. And when you add up all of the rain from that weekend, it was closer to 18, 19 inches. And there might have been some higher amounts unofficially. So that's the official record. And climatologists and the Weather Service also, we all acknowledge that's the official record. But this event from 1867 is widely regarded among, again, those of us who are nerdy enough to look. This is regarded as the probable record if we only had measurements. This particular, 1867, we didn't have radars. We didn't have any of the infrastructure. We hardly had any, settlement was pretty early on.
Right.
And so it was actually surveyors who noticed most of what was going on, but a period of rain especially intense on the first night, July 17th, 18th, but then it had continued for a couple of days. But the heaviest rain could have produced totals up to 30 inches, possibly more, just based on estimates. We know that the Chippewa River became wider than has ever been observed since. Miles wide.
Wow.
Basically, and torrents of water. And there were actually, from places that got less rain, there you could actually see the effects downstream for weeks and weeks afterwards. So this appears to be, we wish we had more information on it, but all we have are these surveyors' records and some newspaper accounts. But it seems to be quite a torrent. There's a historian who works as a volunteer for the state climatology office named Tom St. Martin, who really helped us gather some information on that. But we do believe that if we had records, this would be our biggest rainfall in history. Again, potentially 30 inches or more.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, we'll go from extreme rain to extreme drought, the 1930s drought and temperature extremes in Minnesota, the Dust Bowl era.
Yeah. This is one that you kind of look at the old records and you think, what the heck happened here? It was dry, and it wasn't dry every single year. We were not in the heart of the drought. It was much worse in Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma, but in Minnesota, really beginning in the 20s and then maxing out in the 30s, we went into a long-term rainfall deficit, and that went season to season. Again, the same reason that Seattle tends to be more mild and Minneapolis tends to be more extreme has to do with moisture. And you can sort of apply the same thing. When you take an extreme climate and you remove the moisture, so you put them into drought, well, now you're probably going to make the temperatures even more extreme. So Minnesota's all-time temperature records, and almost every location in the state with long-term records has their highest temperature recorded in 1936. We had 114 and a half degrees, 108 in Minneapolis. We had lows that failed to get below 80 degrees. It was brutal.
Wow.
And multiple days on end in 1936 that were highs of 100 degrees or greater in Minneapolis.
And air conditioning wasn't plentiful in those days, to say the least.
Yeah, no, it was a stinky time, and there were lots of deaths, unfortunately, and there was no way to cope with that. And then you turn it around in the same winter. So the winter right before that extreme heat, we had a lot of all-time record lows set because it was so dry that the temperature could drop to basically, at that point, unseen temperature lows. So we had lots of negative 50s, negative 59. I mean, very, very low temperatures. And a lot of stations' all-time lows were also recorded during the 1930s. So we had no rain, we had high temperature extremes, low temperature extremes, and then, well, here's one that we don't see a lot anymore, dust storms.
Yes.
Clouds of dust rolling right into downtown Minneapolis at times. So even a thunderstorm could kick up a big cloud of 30, 40 mile an hour moving dust. So it was quite a time.
Wow. Well, we talked about this a few weeks ago, and you had mentioned that there are some lore associated with it that might not necessarily be accurate, but the infamous Armistice Day Blizzard in 1940.
Yeah, and it needs no lore. I mean, it was a beast. It was a moose of a storm, and it killed a lot of people, and it was another low-pressure system. So again, we just need to get used to low-pressure systems are weather makers, and it was very close in intensity to the windstorm of 1949. It had deep, deep low pressure, down around what we think of as 970 millibars, which would be, I guess, somewhere around below 2,900. 29
So we're talking
inches,
low pressure.
Very low pressure. And this did have a rapid temperature drop and also a lot of precipitation. I mean, in the Twin Cities, we received over 2 inches of precipitation and 16 inches of snow. And there was ice and there was, 50 to 70 mile an hour winds. So this thing was brutal. And obviously outside of the city, especially where it was very dangerous. And it unfortunately froze some hunters on the Mississippi River. And there were a lot of deaths, mostly from people who were stranded in the storm. So it is a historical storm. There are other great winter killers of the past, but this one is kind of the most recent of the historical super blizzards, and it definitely deserves special notice.
Finally, we're moving to 1965, the tornadoes that struck the western and southwestern suburbs and the northern suburbs of the Twin Cities, often known as the Fridley tornadoes, but we should point out a number of other areas were devastated by them as well.
I think if you were in Norwood, they would call it the Norwood tornado.
Yes.
And if you were on Lake
Chanhassen tornado,
the Chanhassen tornado or the Mound tornado. But there's a lot going on with this storm system. So it was repeat tornadoes affecting the same areas. So we had 6 tornadoes confirmed, basically across the western and northern Twin Cities metro. Depending on how you look at it, you might find another 1 or 2. I think there was probably 7 or 8, but it doesn't matter. It was a zoo of tornadoes, and these were not the kind of tornadoes that we normally see in Minnesota. These were very intense tornadoes, and some of them were wide, and they were doing a lot of damage. The death count, I believe, is 13. There were hundreds of injuries. Again, we can't really compare the damage because numbers were different then, and also our population coverage is different now.
Right.
But this would be a big deal right now. But another thing, the tornado window was about just under 3 hours long, meaning that in a 3-hour period, that's when pretty much all of the tornadoes occurred. But before the tornadoes began and after the tornadoes ended, the same thunderstorms were parading along the same axis and producing all kinds of hail reports. So this is also far and away Minnesota's most damaging hailstorm on record. Hail reported golf ball to baseball size frequently throughout the evening, again, beginning before the tornadoes were first reported and ending well after dark. And so, when you add up the hail and then the more obvious issue with the tornadoes, this was a major high-impact weather event for Minnesota, and it affected a heavily populated area, and there's a lot of other reasons that this system is famous, but that's enough for now.
Well, there's something also that sets this apart from the other major events we talked about, and that's technology. By 1965, we had weather radar, and that particular night, there was a very skilled radar operator. You and I and others have spent a lot of time looking at that radar film, and it was pretty spectacular in how it indicated where the tornadoes might be based upon the hook echoes.
Yeah.
And the other thing that happened is the media really played a major role in the warning process. We should back up before that and also say the other thing that's pretty unique about this is the first time the civil defense sirens were used other than for testing. The folks at the then U.S. Weather Bureau had the presence of mind to think maybe we ought to activate those sirens to let people know what's coming their way.
Yeah, it was a lot of good fortune. People also knew what to do when the sirens go off. I mean, I see the sirens go off first Wednesday of every month, and most people are like, I think I heard that. I don't know if people really know what they're going to do.
Right.
And we have, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, we have some still unsolved issues with notifying people when there's a tornado type situation. But in 1965, people were well trained. WCCO Radio had not quite a monopoly, but they had a really good hold on the market, right?
About 60% of the audience listened to WCCO, the radio audience.
Yeah, and so the information was highly consistent that evening, and there was good coordination. We had a well-trained public. So even though when we look at those old tornado outbreaks, we say, well, we'd probably be a lot better off now because of technological improvements and advanced warning. Well, actually, that one in 1965 probably serves as this is almost as good an outcome as you could get. And I'm not sure if we do as well now. I mean, again, not that we'll ever get an exact repeat, but the area's population is much larger, more expansive, more diverse than it was in 1965. So we have a lot more language barriers, a lot more congestion on the road, a lot more uncertainty about where to go. People don't get the same source of information. They're not as well trained. So I'm not positive, even though we've got superior technology and forecasting skills, and you think our radar operator was good that night. We've got the best in the business at the Weather Service. But it's still not clear we would do better if there happened to be a repeat, which I'll have to say, there won't be a repeat. We'll get other bad events, but they won't ever repeat themselves exactly.
Well, on that night, WCCO Radio was taking phone calls, and it's kind of an interesting situation that was rather happenstance because there had been some significant flooding earlier that spring, and we can talk about that on a future episode here. But WCCO had installed a flood service center phone bank, and for whatever reasons, the phones had not been disconnected, and that proved to be a very good thing on May 6, 1965. And they took calls from listeners, and using a simple highway map and a magic marker, were able to triangulate based upon some of these reports from listeners where the tornadoes appeared to be. And there's some pretty compelling audio. Somebody had the presence of mind that night to record the entire 5+ hours of phone calls and coverage that WCCO Radio had. And you can actually listen to that on a website, radiotapes.com, and I think you click on WCCO Weather, and it's there, and it's worth a listen.
I think it's in their special recording section.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that, because I've listened to all the audio and you've listened to all the audio, and for anyone else who wants to listen to the audio, what's great, and it should give you some comfort, is there was even junk reporting back in 1965.
Yes.
I mean, there were some very astute observers calling in and giving detailed reports, and they were clearly observing tornadoes. And then, just like you got on message boards in the 2000s and in the late 90s, and just like you get now in the comments section under any blog, any podcast, any YouTube channel, there's good stuff, and then there's, I don't know.
Right.
And some of those reports coming in were hysterically bad also. And it's just sort of comforting to know that, when we think about poor information and an uninformed population, and we maybe think we get myopic and we think, well, must be as bad as it's ever been. We've always had this issue. We've always had a difficult time with the notion that we're getting some good information and some less good information. And you have to be a very discerning eye or ear to kind of figure out which is which. But they did a great job of kind of triangulating all of that in 1965.
Well, some amazing pieces of history here. The weather history of Minnesota, which continues to be written, it seems, every year. So at some other point, we'll revisit perhaps some of these events and talk about some others that we haven't gotten around to yet.
Maybe something will make history this year.
You never know.
I mean, last year we did have we had some history-making events, I think. I think going from ice on the lakes to swimming in the same lake in the same month,
Right.
That's historical. Or that's historic.
Yes,
and
yes.
and having, what I thought was great, we had that mid-April blizzard. Oh man, right in the Twin Cities.
Right.
But it didn't even set the daily snowfall record because there was a blizzard on the same day in 1983. So we had these sort of two-headed monster tying for historic relevance, but great mid-April snowstorm. So we had a lot in 2018, but who knows? Maybe we'll be able to add to history, but it doesn't look like it's coming in the next week, Jim.
Seems to be pretty mundane on the horizon here. Well, anyway, we'll check in with you again next week. We'll have an El Nino update. Kenny will be able to talk again about whether or not we're going to have a gray Christmas, how that might be looking. And we'll just look at the weather moving forward for what is going to be about mid-December next time we check in.
We'll tell you if it's going to continue to be a snoozer or not.
Right. Well, Kenny, have yourself a great week, and you and I will chat again next week.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. You too.